The dust of the high plains settled like a fine, bitter powder on everything, a shroud for a world bleached of colour by an unforgiving sun. It coated the wooden planks of the town's only street, it filmed the windows of the general store, and it clung to the dark, simple fabric of the dress worn by the woman who stood alone beside the stagecoach. She had arrived in this frontier town with a small, sturdy trunk and a legal document that had proven to be as worthless as ash. Her shoulders were straight, her chin held at an angle that spoke of a discipline learned long ago and far away, but her stillness was the stillness of a creature trapped, aware of the closing circle of eyes, but determined not to show fear. She was the resilient outsider, a woman of East Asian descent, whose name was a melody the townspeople would not bother to learn. They saw only her foreignness, her isolation. Her intended, the man who had paid her passage with promises of a new life and a small but prosperous farm, was not there. A terse, dismissive note from the town's foremost merchant, the man who also served as its banker, had informed her that her prospective husband had died of a fever 2 weeks prior. His farm, the note explained with a distinct lack of sympathy, had been heavily mortgaged and was now the property of the bank. She was, in a single, brutal moment, rendered destitute and utterly alone. The town watched her. It was a collective character, its thoughts a low murmur of gossip that passed from the saloon to the dry goods store to the blacksmith's forge. They saw a problem, an inconvenience. The merchant, the architect of her immediate crisis, stepped out from his emporium of overpriced necessities. He was a man whose respectability was a carefully constructed facade, a waistcoat stretched tight over a core of predatory greed. He approached her with a smile that did not reach his eyes, a pantomime of civic concern. He spoke of unfortunate circumstances, of the harsh realities of life on the frontier. He offered her a place to stay, a room above the saloon, and work. The nature of the work was left unsaid, but the implication hung in the dry air, as thick and foul as the smell of stale beer that drifted from the saloon's swinging doors. It was an offer of ruin disguised as charity. She looked at his soft, clean hands, then at her own, which were calloused from work but clean in a way his could never be. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but carried the clear, sharp edge of polished steel. She declined his offer. Her refusal solidified the town's opinion. She was proud, difficult. The merchant's feigned sympathy curdled into open contempt. He made a show of washing his hands of the matter, declaring loudly enough for all to hear that he had done his Christian duty. Now she was on her own. As the afternoon sun began its slow, relentless descent, she remained by her trunk, a solitary island in a sea of indifference and suspicion. The dust swirled around her ankles, and the silence from the townsfolk became a wall pressing in on her. Her composure was a shield, but beneath it a cold dread was beginning to take root. She had faced hardship before, but never a void so complete, so lacking in a single, friendly face. From the far side of the street, leaning against a support post of the livery stable, the male protagonist had watched the entire sad spectacle unfold. He was the just landowner, a rancher whose property lay a good half-day's ride from the town's petty cruelties. He was a man of few words, a widower who had buried his heart with his wife 5 years ago, and had since surrounded himself with high fences, both literal and emotional. His visits to town were rare, practical affairs for supplies, and he seldom spoke to anyone beyond what was necessary. He had seen the woman arrive, had noted the quiet dignity in her bearing. He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes as she scanned the small crowd, and he saw it extinguished by the merchant's slick pronouncements. He knew the merchant for what he was, a scavenger who fed on the misfortunes of others. The rancher's sense of justice, a thing he thought long dormant, stirred within him. It was a low, steady anger, not fiery, but solid and heavy as granite. He saw not an inconvenience, but a person being ground down by circumstance and malice. He observed her straight spine, the resolute set of her jaw as she refused the merchant's insulting offer, and he recognized a strength that mirrored the harsh beauty of the land itself. He pushed himself off the post, the worn leather of his gun belt creaking in the quiet. His movements were deliberate, economical. He crossed the dusty street, his boots leaving clean prints in the fine powder. The town's collective gaze shifted to him, a current of surprise running through the onlookers. The rancher never involved himself in the town's affairs. His arrival in the center of the small drama was an event in itself. He stopped a few feet from the woman, not crowding her, giving her space. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect that was so starkly different from the merchant's predatory courtesy that it seemed to change the quality of the air between them. He did not offer pity. His voice was low and gravelly from disuse, but it was direct. "My housekeeper quit a month ago," he stated, as if discussing the weather. "The house is a mess. My ledgers are worse." He paused, his gaze steady. "I need a bookkeeper, someone to run the household, room and board and a fair wage." It was not charity, it was a transaction. He was offering her a position, a role, something that her dignity could accept without bending. The offer was framed as his need, not her desperation. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She saw a man weathered by sun and sorrow, his expression unreadable, but for a deep-seated weariness in his eyes. There was no guile in him, only a plain-spoken directness. She saw the calluses on his hands, the frayed cuffs of his shirt. He was a man who worked. He was a man who understood the value of it. The town watched, holding its breath. The merchant's face was a mask of thunderous fury. He had been publicly contradicted, his power implicitly challenged. For the woman, the offer was a lifeline, but it was the nature of the offer that decided her. It was a matter of employment, a contract of labor for wages. It preserved her integrity. She gave a short, formal nod. "I am skilled in keeping accounts," she said, her voice steady. "I accept your offer." The rancher simply nodded back. The matter settled. He picked up her trunk with one hand as if it weighed nothing, placed it in the back of his supply wagon, and then helped her up to the seat. Without another word or a glance at the stunned townspeople, he slapped the reins and the wagon rolled out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and shattered expectations in its wake. The journey to the ranch was made in a silence that was dense with unspoken things. The landscape grew wilder, the gentle roll of the plains giving way to stark mesas and deep arroyos carved by water that only appeared in violent, sporadic bursts. The rancher's spread was nestled in a wide valley, protected on one side by a sheer rock face that glowed gold in the late afternoon light. The house was solid, built of thick timber and stone, but it had the unmistakable air of a place that was merely inhabited, not lived in. It was a shell, a place of shelter that offered no warmth. He showed her to a small, clean room at the back of the house, with a window that looked out over a patch of earth that had once been a garden. Then he showed her the office, a small room dominated by a large wooden desk buried under a chaotic mountain of receipts, invoices, and ledgers. "This is it," he said, the words encompassing the desk, the house, the whole of his neglected life. He retreated then, leaving her to the task, disappearing toward the barn and the familiar, undemanding company of his livestock. The female protagonist took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of old paper, dust, and a faint lingering trace of wood smoke. This was her new reality, a ledger filled with another man's life, a house full of another woman's ghosts. But it was also a chance. She took off the jacket she had worn for the journey, rolled up her sleeves, and began to work. Her competence was not just a skill, it was an anchor. In a world that had tried to strip her of everything, her ability to create order from chaos was the one thing they could not take. By the end of the first week, the rancher understood he had not hired a housekeeper, he had acquired a force of nature. The chaos on his desk had been tamed into neat stacks, the numbers in his ledgers marching in disciplined, orderly columns. But she had done more than just balance the books. She had found things. She had unearthed a pattern of overcharges from the town's merchant, small amounts on each transaction, insignificant on their own, but amounting to a substantial sum over the years. It was a quiet, methodical theft, a parasite bleeding his profits. She presented her findings to him without drama, simply laying out the new, corrected ledger next to the old one. The evidence was irrefutable. He looked from the pages to her face. He had expected to see accusation or triumph, but her expression was neutral, her focus entirely on the numbers. He felt a flicker of something he had not felt in years, a deep and profound respect for another person's mind. He had been so consumed by his work, by the physical demands of the ranch, that he had allowed the financial side to drift, trusting in the merchant's veneer of respectability. She had seen through it in days. Her influence spread beyond the office. The house began to change in subtle ways. The constant film of dust disappeared. The scent of baking bread replaced the stale air. She found the old garden plot, and with seeds procured from his own stores, began to coax green shoots from the dry, neglected soil. She mended his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. These were not the actions of a mere employee. They were acts of restoration. She was not just cleaning a house. She was slowly, quietly bringing it back to life. Their interactions remained formal, marked by a quiet deference on both sides. They ate their meals in the kitchen, a wide wooden table between them. The silence that had filled the wagon on their first journey returned, but its character had changed. It was no longer a silence of strangers, but a comfortable quiet, the kind shared by people who understand that not everything needs to be said aloud. He found himself watching her, the efficient grace of her movements, the intense focus she brought to every task. He started talking to her about the ranch, not just the finances, but the livestock, the water rights, the endless struggle against the elements. He discovered she was a keen listener, her questions sharp and insightful. He began to value her opinion, to seek it out. The high fences around his heart had not fallen, but he was beginning to realize that someone was now standing on the other side of them, not trying to break them down, but simply tending the garden nearby. In town, the merchant's fury had been simmering. The rancher's public defiance was an insult, but the sudden cessation of his business was a direct attack on his wallet. When the rancher had next come to town for supplies, he had gone to a different, smaller supplier and paid his bill with a bank draft from another town. The message was clear. The merchant, the predatory pillar of the community, understood he had been found out. His humiliation festered, turning into a venomous need for revenge. He could not attack the rancher directly. The man was respected, if not liked, and known to be formidable. So, he targeted the woman, the source of his current troubles. His methods were insidious. He began to weave a narrative, planting seeds of gossip with the town's most fertile tongues. He spoke of impropriety, of a lone man and a foreign woman living under one roof without the sanction of marriage. He painted her as a conniver, a woman of loose morals who had somehow bewitched the grieving widower. He used social pressure, his wife leading the charge among the church-going women, turning their suspicion into righteous condemnation. The whispers reached the ranch. One of the ranch hands, a younger man who still had family in town, brought the news. He reported that people were saying the rancher had lost his senses, that the woman was a bad influence. The rancher listened, his face impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. He knew this was the merchant's work. It was an attempt to isolate him, to turn the community against him and make his position untenable. The threat soon escalated from whispers to official paper. The merchant, in his capacity as the town's banker, sent a formal notice to the ranch. He was calling in the loan on a significant portion of the rancher's land, a note that was not due for another 2 years. The fine print, which the merchant now claimed was always part of the agreement, allowed for the loan to be called if the property owner engaged in behavior that brought the bank into disrepute. It was a flimsy pretext, a legal trick, but a dangerous one. The rancher did not have the cash on hand to pay the entire note at once. He had 30 days. The merchant's intention was clear: force the woman out or face financial ruin. The ranch was not just land to the rancher, it was his family's legacy, the last tangible piece of the life he had built with his wife. The threat was an attack on his past, his present, and his future. The rancher read the legal document twice, the paper crinkling in his grip. He placed it on the kitchen table where the woman was kneading dough for the evening's bread. She saw the grim set of his jaw and paused, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. He explained the situation in his usual clipped, factual manner, but she could hear the undercurrent of cold fury in his voice. She read the document herself, her eyes scanning the dense, legalistic text. "This clause," she said, pointing to the section the merchant had invoked, "it is vague. It relies on public opinion, which he is manipulating." She looked up at him. "This is because of me." It was not a question. "This is because of him," the rancher corrected her, his voice low and firm. "He is a thief and a coward, and he is using you to get to me." He looked out the window toward the vast expanse of land that was now threatened. For a moment, the weight of the predicament seemed to settle on his broad shoulders, a visible burden. He was being punished for a single act of decency. He could solve his problem easily enough. He could send her away. She would have to go back to the town, back to the mercy of the merchant. The thought was so repulsive it made him feel physically ill. He had pulled her from the fire. He would not now throw her back into it. The 30 days began to pass, each one shorter than the last. The tension on the ranch was a palpable thing. The ranch hands were surly, caught between loyalty to their boss and the pressure from their families in town. The rancher grew more silent, more withdrawn, the old grief and the new anger warring within him. The woman continued her work with a quiet, fierce determination, as if by maintaining order within the house she could hold the external chaos at bay. She spent her evenings poring over the ranch's old account books and legal papers, searching for a weakness, a mistake, a loophole they could use against the merchant. She found none. The merchant had been careful. The trap was well made. On the 27th night, the wind picked up. It was a hot, dry wind that rattled the windows and carried the scent of dust and distant rain that would never fall. It was the kind of wind that made cattle restless and men edgy. It was the kind of wind that carried fire. The first sign of trouble was a faint, orange glow on the horizon in the direction of the north pasture where the dry summer grass was thickest. Then came the smell of smoke, sharp and acrid. The rancher was out of his chair in an instant, his face a mask of grim recognition. This was no accident. The fire was too close to the barn, too perfectly placed to be anything but deliberate. The physical crisis exploded upon them with the speed of a flash flood. The fire, fed by the relentless wind, devoured the dry grass, racing toward the wooden barn that housed his most valuable livestock, including a prize bull and the hay that was their winter feed. The rancher and his two hands were a whirlwind of frantic activity, yelling instructions over the roar of the flames, trying to create a firebreak with shovels and wet sacks. It was a hopeless, desperate battle against an enemy that grew stronger with every gust of wind. They were losing. The heat was immense, a physical blow that seared the lungs, and the smoke was a choking blanket. In the midst of this chaos, the female protagonist emerged from the house. They had expected her to be terrified, to be a hindrance. Instead, her face was calm, her eyes narrowed with an intense, calculating focus. She did not scream or panic. She acted. She organized a bucket brigade from the well to the house, soaking every blanket and quilt she could find. She was not trying to fight the main fire, she was protecting the house. But her mind was working faster than the flames. She saw the direction of the wind, saw how it was pushing the fire in a straight line toward the barn. She remembered something she had read in a book about prairie life, a dangerous and desperate tactic. She ran to the rancher, shouting to be heard over the inferno. "A backfire! We have to start a backfire!" He stared at her, his face blackened with soot, his eyes red from the smoke. It was a mad idea, fighting fire with more fire. It could go wrong, trap them between two walls of flame. But he saw the absolute certainty in her eyes, the clear-headed logic that cut through the panic. He had learned to trust her intelligence. He gave a sharp nod. She directed them, her voice clear and commanding. They moved ahead of the main fire, dousing a line in the grass with kerosene from a lamp. The rancher lit it. A new line of fire erupted, smaller, more controlled, moving back toward the oncoming blaze. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the plan had failed, as the new fire threatened to leap in the wrong direction, but the physics held. The backfire consumed the fuel in the path of the main inferno, creating a wide, black strip of earth. When the wall of flame reached the firebreak, it hesitated, faltered, and then, with nothing left to consume, it died down, leaving a smouldering, blackened scar on the land. The barn was safe. The house was safe. They had won. In the immediate aftermath, a profound silence descended, broken only by the hiss of dying embers and the ragged sound of their breathing. They stood in the smoky dawn, exhausted, filthy, and alive. The rancher saw that a stray ember had caught the sleeve of her dress, leaving a painful red burn on her forearm. He moved toward her, his exhaustion forgotten. He took her arm gently, his rough, calloused thumb brushing away a smear of soot. It was the first time he had touched her with such deliberate personal care. He led her to the water trough and submerged her arm in the cool water. The shock of the cold, the relief from the pain, seemed to break something open within her. A single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. In the fragile light of the new day, surrounded by the devastation, the walls they had so carefully maintained between them crumbled. He found a clean cloth and began to bandage her arm. "My wife," he said, his voice rough with emotion and smoke. "She died in a fire, in our first cabin. I couldn't get to her in time." It was a confession of his deepest wound, a grief he had carried in silence for 5 years. He had never spoken of it to another living soul. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the vast, quiet sorrow in his. "I lost my family," she whispered, the words a fragile offering. "A sickness took my parents and my brother. I came here. I thought it was a new beginning." The shared vulnerability, born from the crucible of the fire, forged a new kind of bond between them, stronger than respect, deeper than partnership. It was a bond of shared loss and mutual survival. In that moment, tending to a wound in the ruins of the fire, they ceased to be merely an employer and an employee. They were two solitary people who had found a flicker of warmth in the cold darkness of their lives. The fire had been a crucible, burning away everything but the essential. In its aftermath, the merchant's financial threat seemed like a petty annoyance, but it was still real. As she was recovering, her arm bandaged, the woman returned to the ranch's paperwork with a renewed, almost obsessive focus. The merchant had tried to destroy them with fire. She would find a way to destroy him with ink and paper. It was in an old, dust-covered property deed filed away and forgotten that she found it. A discrepancy. A survey map attached to the original loan for the North Pasture, the very one the merchant was threatening to seize, showed a boundary line that was different from the one on the bank's copy of the documents. The original deed, properly filed with the Territorial Land Office years ago, included a clause granting specific and inalienable water rights from the river to the rancher's property. The merchant's doctored copy omitted this clause entirely. He wasn't just trying to seize the land, he was trying to steal the water, the lifeblood of the entire valley, and she had found more. In cross-referencing old supply ledgers, she discovered the merchant had been selling the same winter feed to 3 different ranchers, charging all of them for the full amount of grain he had in his warehouse, a physical impossibility. He was not just a thief, he was a systemic fraud. Armed with this irrefutable proof, the original deed, her meticulously corrected ledgers, and a signed affidavit from one of the other ranchers she had discreetly contacted, they rode into town. They did not go to the merchant's bank or to the sheriff, who was known to be in the merchant's pocket. They rode directly to the steps of the general store on the day when the other landowners were in town for supplies. It was a public reckoning. The rancher, a man who shunned public speaking, stood before the assembled men. He did not raise his voice. He simply laid out the facts, his words as plain and solid as fieldstones. He spoke of the altered loan document, of the attempted theft of his water rights. Then the woman stepped forward. She did not speak. She simply opened the ledgers on the back of their wagon, her bandaged arm a silent testimony to the conflict. She laid the original deed next to the merchant's fraudulent copy. The evidence was stark, undeniable. The other ranchers, spurred by this revelation, began to compare their own notes, their own receipts. A low murmur of anger grew into a wave of collective fury as they realized the extent of the merchant's deception. He had been cheating all of them for years. The merchant himself, drawn out by the commotion, tried to bluster and deny, but his words were empty. The proof was right there, in black and white, for all to see. His face, usually a mask of smug civility, collapsed into a portrait of fear and humiliation. His power, built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, evaporated under the harsh light of public exposure. The men he had lorded over for years now looked at him with cold, unforgiving contempt. His social standing was shattered, his reputation was destroyed, he was ruined. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the air scrubbed clean by the confrontation. The external threat was gone, neutralized not by violence, but by intelligence and integrity. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the scorched earth of the north pasture in hues of gold and rose. The silence between them was full of everything that had passed. The fire, the fear, the victory. The rancher turned to her, turned. "The arrangement we had," he began, his voice steady. "It's over. I can't keep you on as my bookkeeper." Fear, cold and sharp, flickered in her eyes for a brief second. Had she misunderstood everything? Was he sending her away now that the danger had passed? He saw the fear, and his next words came quickly, dispelling it completely. "A bookkeeper can leave. A housekeeper can be replaced." He paused, taking her hand, the one that wasn't burned. His grip was gentle but firm. "I'm asking you to stay as a partner, not in the ledgers, but in all of it." He looked out at the land, his land, and then back at her. "I'm asking you to be my wife." It was not a declaration of flowery passion. It was a proposal of a shared life, a heartfelt offer of a permanent alliance, founded on a bedrock of earned trust and profound respect. It was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. She looked at his honest, weary face, and her answer was a simple, quiet yes. A year passed. The seasons turned, bringing with them the gentle rains of spring that washed the black scars from the north pasture, coaxing new, vibrant green grass from the ashes. The ranch was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. A new wing had been added to the house, its fresh-cut timber smelling of pine and promise. The garden she had started was a riot of colour and life, providing vegetables for their table and flowers that filled the rooms with a delicate scent. The ledgers, now their shared responsibility, showed a healthy profit, and the herd had grown. The town's opinion, as fickle as the prairie wind, had completely reversed. The disgraced merchant had sold his holdings for a pittance and moved away. The rancher was no longer seen as an eccentric recluse, but as a man of quiet strength and sound judgment. His wife was regarded with something akin to awe. She was the woman who had faced down the town's tyrant with nothing but numbers. The woman whose quick thinking had saved the ranch from a devastating fire. When ranchers had disputes over land or water, it was often her they sought out for her clear-headed, impartial advice. She had found her place, not as an outsider, but as an integral, respected part of the community she had helped to cleanse. The story concluded not with a grand event, but with a quiet, everyday moment that contained the sum of all their struggles and triumphs. They were on the porch in the late evening, the day's work done. A comfortable silence settled between them as they watched their horses graze in the twilight. He was cleaning a piece of leather tack, his hands moving with familiar, practiced ease. She was reading a book, its pages glowing in the soft lamplight from the window. He paused in his work and simply watched her for a moment. He thought back to the day she had arrived, a solitary, defiant figure standing in the dust. He remembered the fear in her eyes when he had made his proposal and the quiet contentment that had replaced it. Their life together was not one of loud declarations, but of shared glances, of tasks done in unison, of a deep and abiding understanding that needed no words. Their past griefs had not vanished, but they were no longer crippling burdens. They were stones in the foundation of the life they had built together, a life of earned peace and quiet dignity. He reached over and took her hand, and she looked up from her book, her smile as warm and welcome as the light spilling from their home. The ranch, the land, the quiet evening, it was all a symbol of their secured future, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most resilient things can grow in the most damaged soil.